Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Young Entertainment Professionals webinar. Tonight's topic is end-to-end scripted episodic workflows. I'm your host, Joel Welch. The Hollywood Professional Association, also known as the HPA, serves the community of individuals and businesses who provide creative and technical expertise, support, tools, and infrastructure for professional content creation, distribution, and archive. Through its three pillars of activities, community, knowledge exchange, and recognition, the Hollywood Professional Association advances the arts, science, and business of the media and entertainment industry. The Young Entertainment Professional Program is a program created to encourage younger individuals to follow a career in the media content industry. The YEP program is one part of a multi-tiered mentorship strategy of the HPA. For tonight's webcast, our speakers will stop at the end of each section for questions. There will also be a Q&A period after the final speaker. Now, we invite our guests to ask verbal questions by typing into the question box, "I would like to ask a question." And at the appropriate time, I will unmute you so you can ask your question. If you do not have a microphone or wish not to ask a verbal question, simply type your question and I will read it on your behalf. Also, this webcast is being recorded and will be made available for on-demand viewing. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to introduce your moderator, Mr. Jesse Carosi of SIM International. Jesse, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. So my name is Jesse Carosi. I'm the Director of Workflow at SIM and the co-chair of the YEP committee, along with Jennifer Zaidan. So I'm trying to figure out what our YEPs wanted to learn about in this year's webinars that we'll be hosting. Many of them expressed interest in learning more about other departments, how they operate, and how their work affects other people. So therefore, we chose to hold this webinar as an introduction going from acquisition all the way through to delivery as an overview of the entire process. So similar to a workflow meeting during pre-production, if you've ever been a part of one. So our plan is to host more of these webinars after this one with a more focused agenda on a specific department or type of work. Whereas again, today, this is going to be more focused on the big picture, going literally from camera all the way through to localization. So I'll start by introducing. These are the topics that we're going to cover. We have an amazing list of speakers. We've got Simon Jory, Stacey Shayet, Jenny O'Byrne, Lorelei David, David McCallum, John Pelkey, Alastor Arnold, and Babak Kazaruni, and we can have a more in-depth introduction from each of them once we hit their sections. So we'll start from the very top, right from acquisition, with Simon. So Simon, you're welcome to take it from here, and as soon as we're ready, I'll jump into the workflow diagram that we can follow along with as well.
Oh, great. Jesse, thank you very much. And welcome everybody to the webinar. My name is Simon Jory. I'm a DIT, mostly in features and some television. It's been features recently, but the workflow is quite similar these days. We've kind of fallen into a pattern that seems to work. Hopefully everybody can see the diagram. Thank you, Jesse. Yeah, looking at our onset section, I guess the logical place to start is at the cameras, camera acquisition. As a DIT, how much do I need to know about the cameras? I feel that I'm ultimately responsible that the cameras are recording the images in the way we think they are, and that the feed out of the cameras that we're monitoring is what we think it is. So the more I can know about all the camera settings and the operation of each of the types of cameras that we're likely to use, the better. That is a little daunting. There are a lot of camera systems out there. I usually have the benefit of a prep period with the camera assistants for a project. And if there's a camera system I don't know, that's when I definitely learn as much as I can about it. And there's always learning as you go. But I feel that the camera assistants should be able to turn to me at any point and ask a technical question about the camera, and I'll know, either know it or be able to bluff my way through it or find the answer, more to the point. So we're at the cameras. What are the camera settings I'm concerned with? Obviously the codec. Are we ProRes? Are we ARRI RAW? What mode's the camera going to record in? What's the output? 23976 is an old video standard that we use, though we're moving more to 24.000 frames per second acquisition. That solves some problems with our lights phasing on set. Issues like that. What are some of the other issues? The camera settings, the ASA, the shutter, the color temperature settings of the camera. These are somewhat creative decisions on the part of the DP, but I feel a responsibility to monitor that and make sure that's working, that those settings are the way we want them to be. And again, that the signal coming out of the camera that we're monitoring for the DP at the DIT station and beyond, I want to make sure it's what we think it is, whether it's a log signal, whether it's got a look applied to it, whether that be Rec 709 or some other loaded look that we've built or have access to. Also, I need to know, we need to know what settings those are and not be fooled. That would be a problem, as I'll describe in a moment. Other settings affect any of the camera settings that would affect the image or how that camera is recorded. Definitely important. That takes us to the DIT cart. This is important that the DIT cart be a mobile device that we can move quickly between camera setups, get set up, get powered up, get hooked into the cameras, get everything back up to speed so that the DP can see the shot we're setting up. There was a time back in the film days where the best view in the house was looking through the camera, and that's no longer the case. The best view in the house is at the DIT cart. We have the best, I've got the calibrated monitors. But what do we have at the DIT cart? Why do we have that? Why does that exist? The purpose, it does a lot of things, but the main purpose is that the director of photography has confidence in the viewing system. We want to know that what we're looking at and what we're using to judge exposure and lighting is what we think it is. Some of the things that help that is calibrated monitors. Are the monitors too bright? Are they too dark? We had an incident very early in my career where a splinter unit was off outside shooting a shot. The monitors were set for indoors, and they had them outdoors. The image looked too dark. They exposed till it looked good on the monitors. They clipped. The exposure was much too high. They clipped a lot of information. They had to reshoot the following week. So monitors, keep those calibrated. I want to be sure at all times that the monitor is showing us what we think it is, that the signal that we're getting from the cameras, as discussed before, is the signal we think it is, that it's a log signal when we think it's a log signal, or it's got a look applied, or whether or not it's extended range or legal range, the data. The color, whatever I've got settings at the DIT cart. Do I have accidentally left a mode or left a look that we're looking at that we don't know about, and that's affecting our judgment? There'll be scopes. We've got waveforms, we've got vector scopes at our disposal at the DIT cart. And that's where we can really objectively analyze the signal. Your eyes can fool you sometimes on a monitor. So the scopes are a good check. Thank you, Jesse. Yeah, the scopes. We can see our brightness, our exposure, and where the colors are. And this is, of course, a great tool in live color, which I'll discuss very shortly. And the viewing conditions. Very important that we have controlled viewing conditions. so that we can accurately judge the image and the lighting and the scene that we're doing, whether that be a DIT tint, maybe some blacking out, some tools from the grip department if we're in a tight spot. But always conscious of that, always conscious of whether exterior light is affecting our eyes, affecting our judgment of what we're seeing, and maybe whether or not you have a gray surround or some sort of a daylight balanced light, just balancing out your eyes to the viewing environment. These are all considerations as a DIT that you want to explore and come up with the best solution you can. Exposure at the DIT cart. I've got iris control of all the cameras, all the cameras on set. If we're running usually 2 cameras, maybe 3 cameras. This is a very valuable addition that we've had to the workflow being digital. Back in the film days, the video tap from the cameras, that it wasn't of a quality that we could accurately judge where we are with exposure, hence light meters. Whereas now, if we're confident of the viewing system that we're looking at, in the viewing environment we're looking at, and we're checking our scopes as a backup, we can be confident that any iris adjustments we're making on set at live are correct. So all those little variations that you would have let go through and let somebody in DI down the road deal with, we can now do on the fly as we're shooting. And that's
baking that into the actual master files. That's not like the CDL and the LUT on the output here. That's actually going wirelessly back into the camera, right?
Yes, very good point. A lot of what we do as DITs to affect the image is non-destructive, but this is a valuable tool if we have confidence in the system. And yes, we are actually the Preston iris control is the most common, and that's wirelessly talking to a device on the camera that is hooked up to motors that are driving the iris of the lens. So we are actually adjusting the iris of the lens, the exposure of the camera to the sensor in real time. Whether that just be set by the director of photography shot to shot, or whether as the camera's panning and tilting around, we're actually doing iris pulls. That's very common. And again, that's a skill that you get a little better at as with experience, and confidence helps in that regard. Some of the other things we do as a bonus at the DIT station is watch the focus of the cameras. So we can be a set of eyes to the camera assistants. If they're open to getting some advice or our thoughts on that, we can pass on whether we thought that shot was sharp or not. Sometimes very important. Obviously, there's egos involved at the camera system, so you have to be very careful passing on that information or any information from the DP. Sometimes the DP in the DIT tent, usually the key grip and the gaffer, they're working on the shot, and I will be asked to pass on instructions to the camera assistants on the floor through our walkie-talkie system, a system that works well if the team is gelling as a team and there's some trust between you and the camera assistant. So that's something to build over time and very useful. Jesse, unless you think otherwise, I'm going to jump to live color. The thing everybody really thinks about when they think the DIT station is the coloring and the live color. You can get by without this, but this is, I think, where a full service DIT really adds value to the system. The DP is able to create his or her initial look on set in real time with the director and the producers present, signing off on that. That look also allows the director of photography to adjust the lighting based on the look. If we've got a very strong look, of a very high contrast look, a noir look, he can see in real time that adjusting the lighting on the back wall, we can do quite quickly on set, and that's going to improve the image greatly in the direction he wants, as opposed to having to deal with that later in post as a window and take time in the DI that may or may not happen when that comes to it. But so that's a great, I think that's one of the most valuable things that the digital workflow has brought to the director of photography on a film, on a movie set, on a production. And that look gets sent to the daily stage, and we'll discuss that shortly, where it gets applied to the dailies, it gets applied to the editorial deliverables, and everybody downstream is looking at the vision that the director of photography and the director have, and getting used to that. Anything that we do in terms of that is non-destructive and can be tweaked later or completely scrapped and started from scratch. So everyone has that confidence, yet the director of photography doesn't have to fight the fight to argue for that blue look or that strong noir look or the soft look that they wanted when the producers and everyone, the executives, are used to whatever bland look just the standard dailies might have given them. So again, I think that's very valuable tool in what we're doing. And of course, this is a place where DIT would benefit from learning as much as they can regarding basic color grading, basic color science. And again, that's always an ongoing learning process. You never stop learning that. So don't be discouraged when you start.
And so then, I guess just it would be great to quickly touch on the loader here as a second process. We'll have to move on quickly to dailies, just because we got a lot of people to get through. But I think it would be great to touch on the download segment, even if quickly.
Yeah, very important. Yes, let's jump to that. So my output from any color work we're doing are CDLs and a LUT. Exactly, and that and in the live color portion of that's creating that look live from the image, and that's going to the monitors that everybody's viewing on set and us. And that data, along with reference images, color applied reference images that are a great cross-reference for the dailies process to make sure that the color is translating at their end to what we thought it would. Sound department. So we're gonna take whatever they've recorded. They'll give it to us on a CF card normally at this point. We'll take the media out of the cameras. That's from the assistant, the camera assistants. They'll provide us with that, and that'll either come to me or to the loader. If it's a small production, I'll do this myself with the DIT cart, but if it's a big enough production, I'll have a loader in a separate workstation, usually on the camera truck. And all that material will need to be moved off of whatever the media is handed to the loader and onto a RAID backup that we have on site, and a shuttle drive, or here I believe it's called a rotation drive. And this is what we're going to send to dailies, and that basically goes in a Pelican case and is sent over. We prefer that all those drives are our backup drive and the shuttle drives be encrypted. Simple Apple encryption seems to work just as another level of security. Jesse, anything else on that?
No, I think that's great. And if anyone has any questions, Joel, if anyone submitted any, we can take a quick break to answer any questions before we move on.
We do have 3 questions in the queue. Earlier in the discussion, Kevin asked a question. Would you explain how the settings that you discussed affect the workflow? For instance, storage, etc. He's especially concerned about the new people that might be on the webcast.
Settings. I'm sorry. Do you think the question's regarding camera settings? I think the idea is if, as an example, like you were talking about different codecs, different formats, how could they affect storage and workflow? I think that it makes a major difference. I mean, if you're recording ARRIRAW OpenGate versus ProRes 3.2K, there's a massive difference in terms of this backup one that's here as to how much storage you're going to need, in terms of how fast your card readers are, that you have at this loading station. There's a lot of factors there, and I think it would be a great idea if you're curious about those data sizes to get a data calculator. You know, we make one that's called the Sim Data Calculator, and it's free, and it'll show you all that information side by side with all the various codecs and frame rates, and it's a very important thing during pre-production to figure out. And you know, in terms of those other settings, the live signal that's coming out of the camera, this color flow from Simon's cart, and to make sure that that's going to be compatible with everyone in post-production, it's very important that we all understand exactly what's coming out of the camera and exactly how Simon's interpreting it, which you'll hear Stacy also speak to a little bit once we get into dailies.
Great, thank you. Aurora, I love that name. Aurora asks, are light meters still being encouraged to use on set, or are you moving more towards using the monitor scopes for exposure evaluation?
Well, I think I'll quickly answer that. I wouldn't say they're encouraged. They're still a useful tool for the lighting and pre-lighting process, so that directors of photography are getting an idea of where their values are at, so that when we turn the cameras on and we point them, they've got it roughed in. Certainly I would use the scopes and recommend the use of the scopes at any point, because the scopes are actually a real-time spot meter that's showing you the values of every pixel in your image. However, if we've got to send a splinter unit out to just shoot an establishing shot of the high school or whatever, definitely just to get it in the middle of exposure, so we're not clipping and we're not too low or too high on the scale. Yes, the old incident meter will work great for that.
Thank you. Our special guest John says that for some of the new people online, a lot of the acronyms that are being used, they may not understand. So if you could please explain those acronyms. And in that spirit, he asks, what's a DIT in this context?
We never touched on that. It stands for Digital Imaging Technician. And it's something that really formed when we started using digital cameras. And at one time, the first AC was responsible for all technical aspects of the first assistant cameraman, responsible for all technical aspects of the camera and the whole camera system and the whole workflow. This just got too complicated too quickly that that split into two jobs. Others and acronyms. Jesse, which other ones should we touch on here? CDLs, that's a color decision list. These are all things that, if you're interested, definitely you want to look into and you want to look up.
Yeah, and lookup table would be LUT, which is essentially a color transform. I mean, there's different types of LUTs. Yeah, that's one. You could just Google the word LUT. You'll find a lot of information on it. But in this situation, he's converting from log C to Rec 709 as a color space, which, you know, when you're looking at the image out of the camera, it's going to be in log. It's going to look milky and washed out, whereas we want to convert it to the Rec 709 spec, which we're all going to look at when we watch TV.
Jesse, if I can just touch on that, the reason for log, the reason that we would monitor or do anything in log, and a version of the image that doesn't look correct, the reason for that is that that image is showing all the range of the sensor from the lowest part to the highest part. Once we go to a Rec 709 or some sort of a more viewable color space, we would call it, but an image that looks more accurate and snappy, we're sacrificing these. We're cutting highlights, we're trimming, we're adding gamma, such that if we did that all the way across, we would end up losing, on certain shots and certain scenes, we'd end up losing some stuff. So we want all the information. That's why we use log, and as long as the dailies process, the next process, that their version of the log of that image as a start point is the same as ours on set is very important. That's something we check in prep to make sure that everybody's got the same start point, and then the color that we all create gets applied and translated the same across the board, so that everyone's looking at the same thing. Hence a lot of the reference images and stills we would take to cross-reference that. And any of these topics we could easily talk for an hour and a half on just by themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
One final question,
Okay.
if you don't mind. It's from Giatsna. I have a question. It says, what is the file size is going to the loader's download station, and how do you handle the network conditions in live scenarios?
The file sizes vary depending on what we're doing. And again, the faster RAIDs and these shuttle drives, if we can make make them RAID drives or whatever speeds up that the card readers can handle, that the system you're using, maybe it's a tower versus a laptop, can handle a little more throughput. That all helps. Again, a lot of that's decided in pre-production, whether you're going to be ARRI raw, open gate, whether it's going to be 6K, 4K. That all affects Dailies. That affects the entire editorial, as we'll see, about how much material. If it's a big production that makes where the material is valued for a long time, and we're going to do a lot of work in DI, that makes sense. If it's a commercial, if it's a small production, if it's a smaller movie, maybe a ProRes codec that'll save space. Maybe any number of other shortcuts we can take that will save file size might be appropriate. But on some of the big,
it sounds a little loose saying that the file sizes are all over they range greatly, but they really do. If you shoot on an ARRI 65, you're looking at 2.8 terabytes for every hour recorded, compared to an Alexa XT ProRes 444 coming in at around 380 gigabytes. So it really is a massive difference depending on what format and codec and camera you're shooting on.
Yeah, and it can take an hour or more to download each card. Hopefully we can have 2 or more going at a time. Yeah, these are all definitely a concern. And at the end of a long day, whether the loader's stuck in the truck for an additional 2 to 3 hours at wrap when the trucks need to move, this can be a problem.
One relevant comment from Chris, and then we'll move on. Chris says, just a point, LUTs on a more fundamental level is a data construct that one color value or channel value is converted to another. The data format of LUTs is simply a text file in this context, but some tools make LUTs binary data. Finally, there are several coding examples of LUTs if you're more interested in that context. And that is the final comment for this section.
All right, so I'm going to jump over into the Dailies section, and the next speaker we have is Stacy Shayette, and she is the workflow producer at SIM. So over to you, Stacy.
Thank you, Jesse. And as you mentioned, I am the SIM New York workflow producer. Basically, my position at SIM oversees all daily shows that come through our office. Just to take a step back, in case you aren't familiar with what dailies are, dailies themselves are intermediary files created from the raw camera and sound media that we get from somebody like Simon on set. As we were just discussing, there can be a huge range of capture formats these days. We have up to 8K. We have ARRI RAW, Red RAW, all sorts of crazy file sizes. And basically, a couple of reasons why dailies are created would be that you're essentially creating compressed files that marry the audio, video, and color information from set. All of those 3 components are captured separately on set. So the dailies process takes them and puts them all together for editorial to cut with, as well as all of production and post and studios to watch in a screener platform. Another reason to create dailies, is that say you are shooting 4 hours of media a day and you're shooting ARRI RAW, 3.8K or something like that, and basically, you end up with terabytes of data a day. You could end up with 5 terabytes of data a day. And that being online all the time, say you have a 10 episode show and you're filming all the episodes at once, your show could end up being 250, 300 terabytes for the entire season. And that's a lot of material to have online at once. So the Dailies process in creating compressed files helps post cut down the amount of material that they need to access. For instance, our most common deliverable is Avid material that we'll make. DNX36 is probably the most widely used format. And then you can see on this diagram that Jesse's got that there are a few different deliverables that we'll make. But that's the main one that they're going to cut with. And that, to give you an idea of file size, that is 16 gigabytes per hour of media versus, the 300 or the 2 point whatever terabytes that Jesse had mentioned earlier for the capture. So as you can see, part of what we do is help alleviate an enormous amount of material that has to be moved around from editorial offices to, screening services and things like that. Another reason for Dailies is that Dailies department may potentially be the first eyes recorded on, or eyes on the recorded material. In a situation where Simon is live grading, he may not have time on set to watch back all of the material that's been recorded to the cards. His loader has time to download it, but doesn't have time to watch it down. So one of our jobs is to QC that material, ensure there's no corruptions, we're not missing anything that's been supposed to have been recorded, there's no artifacting from the camera or anything like that. And we, will coordinate to make sure that we know exactly what has been filmed and make sure we're not missing anything. So our Dailies department at SIM will work with production office, camera, editorial, VFX, picture, and sound finishing to ensure all departments have the material they need the way they need it. Each show is a bit different, and so we'll mold our communication and our workflow based on the exact needs of that show and the acquisition specs. So if Simon tells us that they are, going to be doing ARRI RAW, we will work with, the finishing department, whoever the vendor is, him or another house, and make sure that they understand that what's going to be needed on their end for ingesting the ARRI RAW material. We recently just did a pilot that was on the new red Monstro sensor. So we reached out to the finishing house and said, hey, just wanted to make sure you knew or you guys were on the same platform as us, because you need a certain OS, you need a certain driver to make sure the material could actually be read in the software. So basically, you need to know a little bit about everything to do Dailies. That's why we kind of say you kind of have to be a jack of all trades in some ways, but just enough to know how to talk to each department and make sure that everybody is taken care of. Because you essentially want to make sure that what you do in Dailies will translate properly to the online. I mean, it's kind of one of the most important things is to ensure that anything that happens at this early stage in making a television show is going to make it to the last stage in making a television show. And that goes back to, Simon's color stuff that he was talking about. So we'll heavily work with the DIT in pre-production, make sure that our monitors are matching and that our color pipe is matching exactly, so that when we do apply the color from Simon, we're looking at the same thing that he was looking at on set, meaning that when we render out Avid material for the editor, they're looking at the same things that the DP was looking at on set. So if you look at the workflow diagram there, you'll see a bit about how our typical workflow goes. We'll get that rotation drive from set and we'll offload it onto our SAN. From there, we kind of go in two directions. One is archiving, which we will be writing LTOs. That's pretty much the industry standard. What is an LTO? An LTO stands for linear tape open, and it is essentially the industry standard for master archiving of digital acquisition. Basically this, in the film days, you would have your film reel, you would stick it in, a refrigerator, and then you save it there for 100 years, it's there. For digital, we have these things called LTO tapes, and they have a long shelf life, whereas something like a spinning hard drive disk or a SAN has a very short shelf life. So this is the way to keep your material and know that it's going to be there in many, many years if you need to go back to it. The other direction that we go is to process the material. So you can see there we've got sound sync and apply the DIT's color correction. And we will create any type of screener that production requires. So the main thing that we'll be creating will be the Avid material for the editor. But then on some shows, we can have up to 3 or 4 other deliverables, which may include a DAX. Here you see DAX is one of the main online streaming screener services, and we will create H.264's very compressed files that we upload to the DAX system. And those files we will, either the Dailies house will send out to a predetermined list by production and post, or sometimes post is the one who sends out the material, and then everybody on the team can review the material. Sometimes we also put a higher quality H.264 or perhaps even the same DAX H.264s on a hard drive and send that back to set. So we could send that back to Simon, and he could either watch it down on his computer with the DP, or he could stick it on an iPad for the DP to have, so that they have a reference on set for them to look at. They can look at everything, very quickly. They could scrub through everything that was filmed, the previous day. So once we have all of our Avid material processed out, there's a couple ways for us to get the material to the editor. Most of the time, we're using a program called Aspera, which is a high-speed internet connection, and we'll send it straight to the editorial facility, and oftentimes straight to their server, which a lot of times would be the Avid ISIS server that they'd be editing from. Other times when it's local, they may be editing in our facility, so we'll just kind of take out that Aspera section and connect directly to editorial server, and it will all be there for them in the morning.
Cool.
All right. Yeah, so other things, I would say going back to Simon and the color pipeline, that's a really large part of what we do, and ensuring that the vision of the DP and the director does get to all the different departments. So anybody looking to get into dailies, I think a general knowledge of color is certainly encouraged. But as I said, kind of a little bit of everything is encouraged. It's definitely one of the reasons why I love working in this world, is because I do get to learn a little bit about a lot of different things, and there, as Simon said, there's always more to learn. So the different shows you get on and the different acquisitions that you work with allow you to dive into many different facets.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Stacy. And if anyone has any questions.
And we have one question from Giotsna. It's, and she says, you can call me Joe. I have a question. Do you have to do color correction for the different devices screen that it needs to get distributed?
That's a great question. No, generally we create, the H.264s and the Avid Dailies. They'll all be made from the same color, which should be, based on the color that Simon gives us. There will be occasion that, sometimes we'll work with Simon very closely and he may say, oh, the B camera ended up being a little bluer than the other camera. Can you make sure that we take a little bit of blue out of that B camera, and we'll adjust for that. But mostly, we're ensuring that the color that Simon and the DP approve on set is what gets processed out. And there's, at this stage, generally no need to do different grades.
Yeah, we used to back when we first started. When we first started doing dailies, that we had to make slight adjustments depending on the output. But now, if you're using something like ColorFront or any other application that's on that level, they handle the color science so that it matches between each of them.
And the expectation, Simon here again, the expectation, of course, would be that whatever people are viewing it on is adhering to a calibrated standard that the material looks correct, as opposed to us adjusting to everyone's viewing environment. The viewing environment should be calibrated to a standard.
Great. We have a few more questions here from Jing Jing. Who does the online master drive get sent to?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, we didn't get to that section. Those are often used in our scripted or episodic shows, whereby the online facility would prefer to conform from a drive rather than the LTO. There's, different ways that different facilities will online stuff, but basically what it is it's a hard drive with all the camera master material, and it'll go to whoever's finishing the show, and they can basically load off of the turnover from editorial, which I'm sure we'll get into later on in the conversation. They'll turn over an EDL and they'll pull from those drives based on that.
Okay. And Joe asks, do you use HLS instead of H.264?
No, right now our standard is H.264. We're sure, are open to whatever the client needs us to do, but I would say right now all of our clients are still H.264.
Thank you. We have two more questions and then we'll move on. Morgan asks, does the DP ever have access to the full res files so they can check results of the previous day without the heavy compression?
Yes, they'll have access on set with Simon, and we at Sim, I know we have an open door policy whereby the DP is certainly free to come in to the facility and watch anything back, but they definitely have the ability on set to watch things back.
Simon, here, could I just...
The idea of them having their own personal hard drive with all the master media, though, no.
No, oh, good point, Jesse.
Yeah.
No, Simon here. One thing I do like to get in my workflows is, as I send reference stills to the lab or whoever's handling dailies, that I also request that they send back still grabs from their session, full res, showing just some of the key moments of the day's work, so we can look at that on set at the start of the day without having to go through dailies or whether that be online, and we can just see a number of key moments and just as a check, a visual check to where we're at. That's helpful.
Yeah, for
Right.
sure. We're definitely doing that a lot on our shows too. And I've also heard it's much faster and easier for the DPs to quickly scroll through these high res stills as opposed to you say you have 6 hours of dailies to watch back. It's much easier to scrub through a few stills than to watch scrub through 6 hours of material.
Jing Jing gets the final question for this section. How is the DIT's color correction different from the post color correction?
By post, do they mean finishing, perhaps? Or do they mean our color correction? I would say, like, for the dailies color correction, as I said, we keep closely to what Simon wants. If there's camera matching to the different angles that need to happen, we'll certainly do that. But how it differs from finishing, I would say generally, there are instances where this is not the case, but generally speaking, the dailies color is considered primary grade only. So we won't go in and we won't add or adjust secondaries or adding windows or things like that. Like for instance, color picking, saying I want that red coat to be purple. We won't do stuff like that in dailies. That would come in the finishing.
And Jing Jing did clarify DaVinci finishing color correction in post, so I think you answered that.
Oh,
Thank you very much. That is the final question.
All right, so we've got a little bit of a gap in between dailies into our VFX people on the call. So I'm just going to fill a little bit of that gap in that once the media gets to editorial, there's often someone that's hired by production as a VFX editor on visual effects intensive jobs, and they are in charge of reaching out to whoever is holding the master media and turning over shots for the VFX facility. So they'll assign, you can see here, assign VFX shot names to shots that have been approved to go to the vendor. So they'll create a list, an EDL, an edit decision list, which gets sent to the Dailies lab, which is essentially a list of every file that has been approved to get worked on by the visual effects company. So that will go to usually the online facility, whoever's doing the finishing, or the Dailies lab. And typically the reason that you go to one of those places is because they're the ones that have the master media. They would then take the acquisition files, use a program like Transcoder or DaVinci Resolve or Hero or many other proprietary systems that different facilities have, and they would convert to DPX or EXR files, and that is what the VFX facility is going to want to use. They're not going to actually work from the raw files. Now, there is the odd time that EDL might come to us and we might actually turn over the camera masters and the VFX facility does their own conversion, but that conversion happens one way or another. And that usually then gets sent to the VFX facility through something like Signient or Aspera, and that goes directly to the facility that the shots are meant for. So on that note, I am going to turn over to Jenny and let her introduce herself.
Thank you. This is Jenny O'Byrne. I'm one of the few lead visual effects editors that we have here at ILM, Industrial Light and Magic. And beside me I have...
Hi, my name is Lorelei David. I'm also a lead visual effects editor here at ILM, and we're here to talk about VFX editorial. It's very exciting. I want to start off by just saying that VFX editorial, it's gone from being a pretty niche discipline to being everywhere. 20 years ago when I started, 60 shots was a super huge show, and now Jenny, for example, was on a 2,000 shot show. Yeah. So it's kind of evolved over the years. VFX editors are primarily, we're translating from VFX speak to film speak because we're sort of the technical liaisons between the VFX artists and the cutting room. For example, for VFX speak, VFX artists want to talk in frames, but editorial wants to talk in time code. Artists want to talk in plates, but the cutting room wants to talk in shots. So we kind of understand the different disciplines and how to relate that back to the cutting room. Our main job is to shepherd the frames that Simon and Stacy have so gracefully given to us. And we push these through the pipeline at our facility from plate photography then out to final conform. We thought that showing how we walk the frames through these different disciplines would provide a good example of what our jobs entail. So first of all, what we want to talk about is ingesting all this material. We're getting material from two sources. One is from Dailies and one is from the frames themselves. So we're getting the Avid media and we're getting the EXRs, and Jenny's going to talk about ingesting the Avid media.
Yeah, so the first step of this process, as Lorelei explained, is we receive the Avid media or the offline cut. That will be our visual reference or our guide to usually tell us the idea behind what they want in the shot length, and any timing or reframing notes that they want to include. This is all provided by the client VFX. So they have their own separate department that has been editing the sequences and the shots together and doing these, as we call, rough mock-ups of what they are intending to see. When our visual reference is received in the form of the Avid media timeline, we always like to get our hands on as much metadata as we possibly can. So it's really important to try and get that timeline from the client. Also, any temp retimes, reframing, any optical effects that they've included in this material is all very transparent to us, so we can see the coordinates and what other type of information that they could pass along, because this immensely helps our artists when we can actually give them a rough guide. Moving on to the next process is when we're plate checking, we use the Avid media and the cut reference to actually make sure that we have the proper amount of frames coming back from the scans, or what we call scans for plates. And this is just to confirm that what we're loading, we have what we need to load, and that all the shot work can be completed with what we have. We export references back to the artist so that they can get a general idea of what was done in the offline cut, and that provides any assistance that would be needed for visual. If any issues are found during plate check, usually we have to trace those back to the source of where it happened, either it being a pull issue or something missing out of the EDL at the time that the plates were pulled, or it could be as simple as just on delivery we had some corrupt frames somewhere. And back to you.
So while we're ingesting the Avid media, we're also helping to ingest the EXRs, DPXs, whatever format the frames are coming in. And at this point, we're working with our comp soups, and we're working with our IOTAs, our technical assistants, and our color pipeline scientists. And we usually have a conversation with the Dailies facility, working also with the CDLs and LUTs to make sure that we're loading everything with the right format, with the right resolution, and that we have the right color space for both the EXRs and for the Dailies. We want to make sure that every shot that we put out as a VFX shot matches the Dailies that the cutting room and the director is looking at. So we're working with the LUTs and the CDLs that Scott had mentioned that they're coming up with the DP on set. And so we're working on that, and then as we're ingesting the frames, we start passing the frames off to the artist once everything gets ingested. So once all that gets confirmed, everything's cool, the resolution looks good, the color looks good, we start pushing it through the different disciplines. And so I'm just going to give a sort of vague, I'm just going to give a brief overview of the different disciplines that editorial works with. And the first one that we work with is layout. The layout artists, they figure out the plate in 3D space. So once they're done with the plate, they can send it down to the people further down the pipeline. With layout, we're making sure that we have all the plates that they need. We're working with layout to make sure that they have the correct frames that are being used. You know, we don't want them to work on the wrong frames. We're going to communicate, once again, any flips, flops, retimes. And then once layout's done with doing the magic that they have to do, then we start handing it off to the animators, which Jenny's going to cover what sort of stuff goes on with the animators.
So once the animation phase begins, it's a little more flexible for full CG shots, but if you are plate-based at this stage, usually any animation takes will come in, and we'll just have to make sure that we are attending to any of the retimes, reframing, that our characters' timing isn't changing or manipulating the plate. And if it usually past this stage, we might even go to a second unit shoot that has been filmed, proposing new cuts, and we might pick out some practically shot effects elements, and that usually entails something like explosions or debris, anything that had been additionally filmed to work within that effect shot. If it is a full CG shot, then it usually gets into more of a cut proposal situation. So we'll likely get takes and then submit several cuts up for proposal to the client VFX and the director for approval.
So then once it goes from animators, then we go on to TD Comp. TD Comp, they're doing all the final finishing touches to the shot. And at this point, usually this is when, if there's some extraordinary handles that might have happened during animation or just during the cut, we'll trim that down. Because, you know, the less frames we have on the farm, the more awesome it is for everybody. So we try to address that before things get too gnarly. So meanwhile, while we're dealing with all the different disciplines, we're also cutting in dailies. We have our own timeline where we're keeping track of all the different disciplines and their latest takes. And we're also trying to just chase the cut and make sure that we communicate any changes from feature editorial to the artists so that they know whether they should be panicking or not. Hopefully they're not. And then once we get through, you know, all the shots going through layout, through anim, through TD Comp, then then we can just escort the shot out the door. We tell it good luck, we give it out to final conform, and then it goes to DI. So that's kind of like a brief overview of how the plate gets traveled through VFX.
Okay, thank you very much. And sorry, I didn't actually move the diagram over until now, but you can see the pipeline here where the CDL and the LUT get reapplied to go back into the file to go to the offline, and then the final file here goes out back in log as it was recorded. But if anyone has any questions.
There are no questions in the queue at this time, but I'd like to remind our guests that you can ask verbal questions and ask your questions directly to the speaker. Also, I was asked if we would be providing a copy of the diagram that's being presented tonight. And yes, we will, in exchange for your feedback about the webinar. What I'll do is please, if you can stick with us until the end, I will post the link to the online feedback form in the chat box. You click on that, submit the completed survey form, and you'll be automatically redirected to a copy of the diagram.
Okay, so I'm going to go back because we have to go all the way back to where we were here within the editorial section. And this is where we are going to turn over to David, who is a supervising sound editor for SIM.
Hello, my name's David McCallum. I'm a sound supervisor. I specialize in dialogue and ADR work, but I'm going to talk about all of sound post-production for the webinar, which generally includes two major categories, and they flow from one to the other. The first is the sound edit, and the second is the sound mix. The sound edit usually begins somewhere near the end of the creative picture edit. We usually try to start sound work at a point where they would say that the picture is locked, but it's very rare, I would say never, that we work in that tight a model of flow anymore. So generally the sound post-production starts near the end of the picture edit. And in an episodic workflow, we'll work normally one episode at a time, although there are some cases where we'll put 2 or 3 episodes into sound at the same time in order to create some efficiencies. And in a film workflow, we're generally starting up our process with a little bit of time left in the picture edit. And the reason for that is that the technology is allowing creative decisions to be made later and later into the process. And so the more time the director or the editor, or in television, the showrunners and creative producers have to spend time with their picture edit, the more that they will. And sound has become advanced enough that we can continue to update and make adjustments to our work while the picture edit is being done. But we generally start when the picture edit is between 70 to 80% of the way complete. And there are two things that, as I mentioned, the sound post-production is in two major categories of editorial and mix. And the first one is editorial. And there are two processes, if we go backwards, that feed into how we start sound editorial. The first is obviously the location audio that is recorded on set, which we'll get a copy of all of the audio. That normally comes from the lab, from the dailies. It sometimes comes from the picture department, sometimes comes from the location recordist, but we will get a copy of all of the sound recordings. And then we'll also get a working picture edit, which includes all of the creative decisions regarding sound that the picture editor and the team of people working in the picture department have made. And that will produce an EDL, or edit decision list. And we use that EDL to rebuild the work that has been done in the Avid in our workflow workstations, which, while it is still an Avid system, it's almost exclusively done in Pro Tools. There are similarities between the way Avid and Pro Tools handle audio, but on the Pro Tools side, it's much more sophisticated in the specifics of sound work. So we'll work with significantly more tracks, and a track is simply a slate where a piece of audio may reside. We'll work in numerous departments, and each of those departments will work independently with some creative interaction. The first part of our process is to rebuild what was done in the offline picture edit, so that we know what the editor and the director and the producers were starting with, and that we have a good idea of where they think they want the sound to evolve to. We then break our work down into multiple categories, as Jesse has in the list. The music and composer, and in that department there's normally a music editor who will work directly with the composer. There is then a dialogue department, which works in connection with the group below, which is the ADR department. And that's my area of specialty. We also have Foley and recording, which is usually done in studio. And then there will be sound effects, BG, and sound design editorial. Depending on the size of the film, the speed that we have to work at, these different positions could all be done by one person, or they could be done by quite a few people. I would say on an average television show, we would have about 8 to 10 people working in sound editorial. And on a larger film, that might grow to double that. It really depends on the speed that we have to work at. In those different departments, starting at the top with the music composer, they will have made a lot of decisions about music in the picture edit. And the music editor's job is to corral a lot of those ideas and then work directly with the composer on the reshaping, or sometimes they're throwing out the work that they got because it might be temp score from another movie. And other times the picture department may have worked with music from the actual composer. Like on a television series, for example, I'm right in the middle of season 2 of Handmaid's Tale. Almost all of the music that the picture editors are using is score from the first season. So the music editor and the composer, Adam, are working with their own material, and they'll then reshape and reorganize the music for an individual episode, but they're at least starting with music that they're very familiar with that was shaped for the show at some point in time. The next category, dialogue, and it's written down there as dialogue assembly. That would be the first process in an overall dialogue edit, and I made reference to that at the beginning, where we would be assembling the material that was recorded on set and organizing it in a manner related to what the decisions that the picture editor made. So for each slate and take and edit that they make, there'll be a corresponding sound edit. And we usually have, in the Avid, they might work with 1 or 2 microphones, and depending on the show, we may have anywhere from 2 to 10 microphones. So there's an expansion of the audio process, which then requires us to weed through it in order to find the specific microphones that we need. And once that whole process is done, sorry, Jesse has a Titan highlighted here, so I'll just mention what Titan is. Titan is a software program that takes the assembled dialogue and snaps it into sync against the guide track. So it gets us a much closer sync relationship than the assembly, which is done from the EDL numbers, provides. There's a few reasons why the assembly doesn't show up exactly in sync. It's usually close, within a frame or two, but there are some overlaps and sort of complex creative decisions that can cause an EDL to be slightly out, and Titan helps us correct those changes automatically, but we then do go through it manually as well to confirm that we've got all the correct audio. The second step of the dialogue edit is to evaluate the material to determine what it is that we have, what's good about it, what we like about it, what we might need to fix technically. And this is where we flow into ADR. So it's a kind of downward or a group connection between those two categories. And ADR stands for Automated Dialogue Replacement. And the reason that we might record additional dialogue, there are about 4 different reasons. The first one is that there's just simply a technical flaw with the material. Sometimes shooting can be very complicated, and it's just not possible to record high quality sound. And so we would have to replace a lot of that dialogue in studio with the actors. Another reason would be because they've decided to write new dialogue that they crafted during the picture edit, or make subtle changes to the dialogue. So we would bring the actors in to record that and do our best to blend it into the original production sound. There might be performance changes or actor changes. If an actor has a heavy accent or was not available, then we may end up changing the performance of an actor. And then obviously there's voiceover, which could be recorded. Simultaneously to the dialogue and ADR department working, there will be a supervising sound editor or sound designer who was crafting the sound effects side. And the reason that sound effects is needed is because on set, really the objective is to record the dialogue, and almost all of the sound effects are produced afterwards. And so the sound designer and the supervising sound editor will shape a sort of creative vision for the show. And that department includes sound effects, BGs, sound design, and that person will also oversee or organize what we would record in Foley. And Foley is a craft of recording specific sound effects, like a cup being put down, or somebody walking or running, switching from walking on pavement to walking on grass. And all of that material will be recorded in studio as a live sound and sent to the editorial department. So as those different groups work together, we're eventually trying to move the workflow down towards the mix. And the mix is where all of those different elements that sound editorial have created get blended back together. And you'll see in the picture the large console that the mixing engineer is sitting at, and all of the different faders that show up there. Each of those faders represents an individual track, and they will be delivered to the mixer in the same categories that I've just described: sound effects, dialogue, ADR. And the mixing department generally would have anywhere between 1 to 3 mixers working together to help build the final soundscape. Usually mixing starts after editorial is complete, but there is a little bit of backward that would go on as new creative ideas come up, or demands for things that had not been addressed in editorial are discovered on the mix stage. Then the editorial department will continue to work and feed that material to the mix stage. In the mix stage, that's generally where the creative collaboration or the individuals involved in the creative all come together. On a movie, you're generally bringing the picture editor and the director in for the majority of the time. In television, there's usually a showrunner or a creative producer or a post producer that drives that process. But it's there where they get to hear all of the work that the crew has put together. The length of time that we spend in these processes is really variable and difficult to predict depending on the show. So it's not really, there isn't really a model to kind of say this is what we do. Films could run for weeks on the mix stage. A television show could be a day, it could be 5 days. On The Handmaid's Tale, we spend about 4 days on the mix stage. And about half of that time is with the creative producers. Depending on the mixing format that they're working in, and that generally is 5.1 is pretty standard for Dolby 5.1, but we're seeing more and more sound tracks being produced in Dolby Atmos, and each of those formats will require a certain amount of attention, and will, even if we're doing our work in Dolby Atmos, we'll then need to produce multiple versions of the film for different viewing formats, because if somebody was watching something on an iPad, for example, they're not going to get the Dolby Atmos sound, but if they had Dolby Atmos at home, they could. So we will, after the mix, prepare media for all of those listening formats.
Okay, well, thank you. Just to keep things moving, I'd like to ask if anyone has any questions at this point.
We have one question from Ariana. Ariana asks, how do you match the sound from an ADR session in studio with audio recording done live during shooting?
Well, there's a number of factors that influence how we would approach that. The first one is the microphone choices. So we often attempt to record in studio the exact same format that they may have used on set, a lavalier microphone and a certain boom microphone. So we will inquire with the recording engineer from the location on a different project what microphones they used, because each microphone does have its own characteristic. We then have to evaluate the environment that it was recorded in. So if it was an indoor location, then there's a certain amount of reverb that is naturally on the production sound. So we'd have to listen to that and make adjustments in our setup to record that. If it's an exterior, then everything gets a little bit tighter because you don't want any natural internal reverb. Once you've sort of selected your microphones, a lot of it then comes down to the actor. The biggest variable that influences whether ADR sounds realistic or not in the final mix is whether the actor's tone and the tenor of their voice matches. And that can be unpredictable, because if an actor was recording a scene in a noisy exterior location and they were outside for 12 hours in the rain, their voice is going to have a particular character, which is almost impossible to reproduce once you're back in studio. So there can be some obstacles that are difficult to overcome, but if the actors can give you the material that sounds the same, then you really can make it pretty seamless. After it's been recorded, it's never going to be perfect. So there are a number of utilities that we would use to help. Essentially, you're adjusting the EQ or the reverb to try to make it as similar to the production audio as possible. And there are some tools like Isotope, which is a software program that's very, very popular, has an actual utility that is called EQ Match. And you literally send it the source material that you started with and the material that you want it to make it sound like that. It doesn't make it perfect, but it really gives you a running start. And then after that, you continue to refine it on the mix stage. So there's no sort of perfect way to do it. You just keep practicing or trying different techniques until you get it right.
Thank you. Martha would like to know, what does BG editorial stand for?
Backgrounds. So the backgrounds are things like traffic, wind, rain, air, river water, the types of things that make a location sound real. And they're often also quite spatial, because a background sound will fill up the entire theater or the entire screen. So that's a category of sounds that we put together to try to orient the audience in a location that makes it seem believable.
Okay, and we have one question in here. I'm having a little difficulty understanding it. It says, how much do SFX files are found by the assistant editors compared to sound editors?
Well, there's very little difference between, generally we work in sound editors, sound effects editors and sound designers will have their own library of sounds, and they'll record sounds on an individual basis as well. And their assistant will have exactly that. So they work very much in collaboration with each other on the assistant sound editor on the sound effects side of the team. So they're actually working with exactly the same material. There would be no difference between them.
Terrific, thank you. That is the last question for this section.
All right, so moving on, we're going to take a little bit of a step back and zoom into once we had the question about what happens with the online master drive, and we talked about that going to the online facility. So from here, we will introduce our next speaker, who is John.
Hi, my name is John Pelkey. I'm an online editor here at SIM, and essentially what my job is, what online is rebuilding the offline editorial sequence in the highest resolution possible, in a wide gamut for color, the least compressed as possible. And the way I do that is I actually work on a system called Baselight, which is a color corrector similar to Resolve, but both Resolve and Baselight are online systems as well. So the way I get the highest quality online, there's many different online workflows, but my particular workflow is I link to the raw camera files. So typically we'll get very only two things from offline editorial to do our work online in color, which is they just send a bin with the sequences that has all the metadata information that we would ever want for the show, and then they send a reference with temp stereo audio, and that's really all we get from them. And once we get the bin, it goes to our media management team. They hook up to the online files from Dailies. Sometimes there's 16 drives for a show, and so they'll hook up the drives and make a list and use an AAF or an EDL or something to find all the clips on the drive and pull them onto our SAN or whatever storage we're using for that particular job. And then once all the media is pulled, which can be a considerable amount of media. Sometimes you can trim the clip, certain things like red footage, airy raw, quick times, you can trim those with handles, and that cuts down on storage. But other raw media you can't, and you have to pull the whole take. So the storage can get considerable, but most facilities that do online in color have lots of storage, so usually it's not much of a problem. And once it's all pulled, I'll take the AAF and point to the raw media and conform the sequence, and a fair number of things come across from the Avid sequence, things like resizes and speed effects, time warps, that kind of stuff. Not everything, but that's okay, because oftentimes effects in offline are temp. So I redo a lot of split screens, because offline editors typically aren't fine tuning split screens. So I'm rebuilding and cleaning up split screens. I do a lot of stabilizations. I do a lot of painting out things like tape marks on the floor, boom mics, that kind of stuff. And then there's also some effects that there's plugins, third-party plugins that offline editors use. And the ones we encounter the most are Sapphire plugins and Boris plugins. And those things, you actually have to go back into Avid to bring them across. So I'll usually render out, the highest quality media possible. Avid media, some sort of if it's an HD show, we'll usually render 1:1 DNX 4:4 and apply the effect and then bring it back into Baselight. Or if it's a UHD show, we'll render out DNX HR 4:4, same thing, apply the effect and bring it back into Baselight, which works really well. And then there's also third-party VFX vendors. So another big part of my job is cutting in visual effects from VFX facilities. So usually you'll get a drop-in sequence from the offline. The assistant editor will send you a pickup sequence, an Avid sequence with the effects, because they get DNX H36 from the VFX vendor of all the finished VFX, and all the powers that be sign off, and when they have a final version, they'll cut it into the show. And so they'll send a track that's just VFX updates, and you get that linked to the DPX or EXR files from the VFX vendor, and drop that into the sequence. But it's all really, a big part of my job is just working in tandem with the colorist, you know, teeing up everything for the colorist so that they're able to do their job, and there's some back and forth between me and the colorist, and so the colorist does all their work, and then at the end of the process it comes back to me. I'll apply.
Why don't we, what might be nice is, why don't we jump over to our colorist right now, and then we can come back and we can keep, we can keep going in order. So on that note, why don't we jump over to Lastor, if you want to jump on the mic.
Hello, can everybody hear me okay? My name's Lastor Arnold. I'm a senior DI colorist at Photochem. I've worked at Photochem about 20 years. I've had a lot of different jobs. Yeah, as you were just hearing, generally there's a pretty interactive approach between the colorist and the online editor. Actually, before I was a colorist, I was an online editor, so I'm pretty familiar with a lot of the processes that are involved in getting things teed up for me, as was mentioned. I guess what we should talk about briefly about what a general idea of what a colorist does, and then I guess we can talk a little bit about some of the workflow items that we've got to look at here too. So generally what a colorist is they're someone who will basically work with the creatives on a project, generally a director of photography and a director. Often, sometimes producers are involved. And what we'll do is help shape the look of a film, either working with the DP with what he wants to do, or maybe coming up with some creative ideas that will work more in DI versus on set. But it's generally a technical and a creative job. It's important as a colorist to not just think about it in terms of the kind of nitty-gritty color work, but also having a kind of broad understanding about a lot of the things that we've been talking about today. So that would include dailies, because a lot of the times on bigger projects we'll interface with the dailies team prior to films even shooting. So we need to understand what those workflows entail, working with the DIT and production team to come up sometime with show look files, whether they be show LUTs or maybe base grades if they're working in Resolve for them to use for different kinds of scenes. Understanding the different camera formats and how cameras work, what codecs they record to, maybe understanding some of the different kinks or problems or gotchas with different camera formats and codecs. And then on from there, obviously visual effects. It's very common for a colorist to be involved with VFX reviews. Generally on big films, visual effects are being worked on well before a picture is locked. So a lot of the time, colorists will sit in the room with VFX editors, directors, and other production executives and review visual effects, look for problems, review the visual effects on the big screen. If we're talking about a feature workflow, TV, it's a little more compressed in terms of the time flows. So it's really important as a colorist to understand a lot of different things, and even a little bit about sound too, although generally we're not involved with sound. It may be important to review sound mixes in the theater or the color bay for TV with executives and whatnot. So I guess we can talk a little bit about workflow. Generally, what will happen is on some shows, the online editor will give me a completed project pretty buttoned up. Other times, films and TV shows sometimes will be kind of a work in progress. So sometimes, there may be missing visual effects, there may be editorial shots that we don't have yet, stuff's getting hunted down. But generally, the idea is that the first thing a DP and a director and a colorist will do, they may generally on bigger projects, as I mentioned earlier, sit together before they start shooting. And sometimes DPs will do look camera tests. They may come to me with visual references, either referencing other films, TV shows, maybe still photography, or just general kind of conceptual ideas about color. And that may be the first thing that a colorist does is, well, we'll sit with those creatives and maybe come up with some different ideas for color and come up with a color lookbook, or maybe at the most simple, a simple showlet for a film. And then once everybody's happy about that, generally we may hand off a show look, a resolve project, or maybe various CDLs, which were touched on earlier, which are color decision lists. So those are a way of handing over basic color correction metadata between different systems. So a CDL will work in Baselight, it'll work in Resolve, it'll work in ColorFront, it'll work in any major color software for dailies or feature finishing. So it's a way of basically handing off color information between different systems, very basic color, but color information that will be able to kind of come along with EDLs and editorial, and that color information can kind of track through all these different workflows involving color. So once we do the look dev, generally the next step would be the VFX reviews. Sometimes those will happen along the way, generally after production's already finished shooting, but there's usually a little window between when a show finishes shooting and when they start finishing for color. And then from there, you may do preview versions for features. This is less common in TV shows, but on feature films, a colorist may get editorial offline cuts that they need to preview for audiences or people to see how, or executives, and they may want to do some color tweaks. And then from there, then it goes to generally, once that happens, then it's the online that we talked about earlier. And the online editor will do their work relinking all of the camera media. Generally, my preference is to work camera raw. As was discussed earlier. It's not always possible sometimes. Generally at photochem on a lot of the bigger films, especially on visual effects heavy films, everything gets transcoded to like EXRs generally, which are pretty much a lossless file format that we work on. And the reason for that being is that generally our SANs are optimized for frame-based media. And it's easier to manage things, and it's also a data management issue where you basically are going to convert everything into a common working space and just basically the nitty-gritty of the shot with whatever handle. So that was discussed on earlier in the online. When things get media managed, a lot of the time you'll get media that maybe the take would be 3 minutes long, but you may only need a second or two of that take. So we only take what we need, and everything gets consolidated in that online process. So once we start the actual process on color, TV show or feature, it generally depends on how big of a production it is. On bigger budget TV shows, you've done the look dev, and the same goes for feature films. A lot of the time, by the time you actually start on the show, you're going to have a pretty good idea of what a show is going to look like. On smaller films and smaller projects, a lot of the time there's not a lot of budget for that early look development. A lot of the time on set they may just be using standard color science for whatever camera it is. So if it's an ARRI show, they'll be using a standard ARRI log C LUT and just basically applying that to the dailies. And maybe if they're lucky, they'll do some on-set color. If not, they may not. So sometimes on films, your initial meetings with the creatives might involve just kind of discussing the look that they're going for, kind of what you may do initially where before they start shooting. On smaller budgeted projects, a lot of the times the first day is just kind of figuring out hopefully what they're going for, and that may happen with conversations before you even walk in the room together, with emails or look devs or references, and then you have to kind of make that happen. And that's the real fun part of being a colorist, is that creative process. And that's one of the great things about the color bay, is it's kind of where all of that hard work on this big workflow diagram that you've seen all comes together, and all the visual effects are done, the editorial's done. You may be starting with finished sound, or you may be waiting for that a little bit. But it's kind of where all of the hard work kind of comes together, and the filmmakers get to sit down and kind of enjoy themselves and really focus on really making their film look as good as it can, or their TV show. And a lot of the time, that creative part also meets the more technical, where part of the role of a colorist is not just that creative part, but the technical of sometimes cameras may be misbalanced, and you need to balance out shots between two different cameras. There may be issues where they may have only had a location for a limited amount of time, and during the day the lighting conditions changed. And this is very common sometimes in shows that are shot in like the South, where the sky can change within a couple of minutes, even within a single take sometimes. So sometimes you have to even out just natural lighting condition changes. So there's that technical work that is involved in shot matching and evening out, sometimes technical fixes. So basically, once that's all done, you're going to get into the process of basically reviewing your work with the director and the DPs and whoever else is involved. So sometimes this work happens in an unsupervised capacity. Sometimes you'll discuss scenes and looks and build a lookbook, either per scene or per reel or for the whole film. And then sometimes they'll leave you alone forever how long that you need to address those creative goals, and then they'll come back in and review. Sometimes you're working one-on-one with the filmmakers for the entirety of a project, and that really does vary from project to project. A lot of the times now, colorists are expected to do more than just color. A lot of the time, we can do beauty work where we're going to be fixing blemishes on actors. We may be doing visual effects type work where we'll do sky replacements. Day for night, I've taken a sky and added stars to it. Sometimes we'll have to do some of the work, the same kind of work an online editor would do, where we may have to paint out a boom mic or remove a camera flag or something like that. Is not uncommon either. And the tools right now for color correction are getting to the point where they're very powerful visual effects tools as well, especially if you look at like a tool like Resolve now with version 15. They've introduced basically a full compositor right into the color corrector. So that's really kind of, and even the sound tools too, which I would never expect to be doing sound in a room, but a lot of those visual effects tools can be used in the color bait too. So it's a lot of knowledge being a colorist. You have to really have a pretty solid understanding of color science, but also all of these different steps, and also being able to work with the creatives and read a room and kind of help people visually realize what it is they're trying to accomplish sometimes. And sometimes you can have a very big part in that process, creative process as a colorist. And sometimes a lot of the time, a lot of that is set by the director of photography. So it varies from project to project, but it's always interesting, and there's definitely always a lot to do. And then generally that last part, once you're done going through matching all your shots, inducing whatever creative goals you have, and everything is approved, generally there's a step called QC, or quality control. And once we'll export out our master files, those will get quality controlled. And it's a standard process for any major project, where they will go through and watch a film and listen to it, and make sure that there's no technical problems or mistakes or glitches in those files. They'll flag anything, and then it's up to you to basically either fix them or say that they're not fixable, or they'd have to go to visual effects to get fixed. And then once that's all done, they could go back to the online editor for those. Sometimes those fixes that get called out in QC may be color fixes, and it does vary from project to project. And then once that's all wrapped up, and I don't know if we want to talk back to the online editor about kind of wrapping up after the color correction process is done or not yet.
Yeah, I think we can touch on that. I think one thing I will note is I put no render required here. However,
that does depend.
Yeah, with this situation between Resolve and Baselite, that's probably not the case.
I mean, and also that verbiage depends on system to system. So I work in Resolve primarily, but I do work in other systems like that do use more of a render specific workflow, and that's system specific. But rendering can also not only refer to sometimes you can do work in the color bay that may be too processor or GPU intensive. So you may do so much to a shot that it is incapable of playing back real time, no matter how beefy your system is. And you'll have to basically render or cache that media for playback for review. But rendering can also refer to that process when you're done and you're exporting. In general, you're baking in your work in a render process and then writing those to files, whatever the delivery requirements are for the project.
For sure.
And a lot of that. Go ahead.
Before we get into questions, though, I think what would be great is to have John, if you close out the, once Alastor would be finished with his work and it gets handed over to you, why don't we close that out and then open it up to a couple questions?
Okay. Yeah. So just real quick, after it's done and the color has been approved by the clients, then it'll come back to me. Oftentimes that's the stage where you'll title it and format it to the specs of the deliverable. And then for me, for making deliverables, whether it's going out to tape for a TV show, I can go straight to tape from the timeline with or without audio. If the deliverable is some sort of QuickTime, doesn't matter how many channels of audio, 12 channels of audio, I can make that QuickTime right out of the base site. The only time I make a deliverable differently is if it's a feature. I'll render out usually a DPX sequence that's P3 and then take that into something like Clipster and make a DCP for digital cinema with 5.1. So that's the only time he goes through like a second render. But aside from digital cinema, usually I can make all the deliverables right out of Baselite. Or if for some TV shows you have to what's the deliverable for Netflix?
Oh, when we go into the transcoder.
Yeah, what's that one called?
The IMF.
IMF, yeah. So IMF is like the television version of DCP, and so that also requires another render. But a lot of the deliverables can be made right out of the color corrector, which is really nice.
Yeah, that's right. And one thing we actually didn't talk about too is this whole new HDR thing that's a Netflix deliverable now. And right. And a lot of the time, and this can get pretty technical, but there's two different competing flavors of HDR right now. And depending on, one of them is HDR10 and one of them is Dolby. And they're different in that there's a new version of HDR that's kind of similar to Dolby too, but Dolby is a metadata driven process, where HDR10 is more of a baked raster kind of process. So they differ in how the product is delivered, and depending on workflows and technical needs, whether for Dolby or HDR10, the workflows could differ as well in terms of how you're delivering the files and what metadata gets carried across, specifically for Dolby via the CMU. Yeah, and there's hyperlog gamma too, but that's generally more for broadcast. Less so for creative grading.
Okay, so why don't we open it up to some questions, and then we will have our last speaker speak to localization.
Okay, and we do have a few questions. First question is from Jason. How does the assistant editor's temp VFX help the VFX editor?
Well, that's not a color question.
Well, I guess that would be a good question for, I think Lorelei actually and Jenny had to leave, so they're not on the call, and unfortunately I can't speak to that.
Okay, we do have another couple of VFX questions from Jacqueline. I'll just read them, and you can either respond or we can send them off to the ladies that left. We can also do it via email. So the question is from Jacqueline. For online, how often do certain opticals like repos, split screens, push-ins, etc., have to get bounced back to VXF? And she goes on to say, I think my question about opticals possibly applies to VFX editors too.
Yeah, so really the question is, how often is the online editor doing opticals versus kicking it back to the actual VFX department?
Yeah,
if I heard that right.
Yeah, I would say if it requires a fair amount of rotoscoping or rebuilding frames, that kind of stuff, that almost always goes to visual effects. But as far as split screens and painting out things, yeah, I do most of that myself. There's some shows that I work on where literally every possible visual effect shot will go to one person or one facility because they have some, a deal with them where it just makes more sense monetarily to do everything with this certain person or facility.
Yeah, that's what happened with when we did Warcraft and the Great Wall and conformed that here. I mean, everything went to ILM. That needed to, and everything like that was treated like a VFX shot. So I don't think it's one way on one shot.
It's not
on every job.
But usually shots that let's just say, to simplify it, the more difficult the VFX shot becomes, the more likely it will be sent to a vendor out of house.
Thank you. Corinne asks, are you finding that productions are trying to find one person to do both online and color these days, or are more complicated VFX workflows keeping those jobs separate?
I think that one thing to mention is that it's very different job segment to segment. If you're talking about commercials versus scripted episodic versus independent features versus multicam shows, reality TV, they all operate slightly different. And when we were separating these, we were really focusing on the higher end scripted episodics and features where, I mean, Alastor and John, correct me if I'm wrong, but I personally haven't seen in this segment of work that get merged.
I would say that you would generally see someone doing both in smaller shops, boutique shops that would tend to cater to more of the low budget kind of work.
Mm-hmm.
I have a background as an online editor before I was a colorist, so I'm totally comfortable in a session like dropping in a shot if I needed to just expedite things, or something like that. And so I would say that the nature of post-production, and the roles we play are getting bigger, and it's not uncommon for an online editor to do pretty high-level visual effects work now. What that maybe 5-10 years ago would have been kicked to a visual effect house, but now that online editor is going to be expected to do a lot more, just like the colorist too. So we all kind of wear bigger hats sometimes, but generally on the bigger projects, it would be pretty uncommon for a colorist to be doing the online editing at the same time. I would guess on smaller projects, that's definitely more common. And I know on very small projects, if I'm up to it, I would be totally happy onlining it, but that would be definitely rare, is what I would say.
And that is the final question for this section.
All right, so let's jump over into, we've got Bobak from Pixel Logic. Hopefully we still have Bobak.
I see that he is online, but has lost his audio. Oh, he has just returned.
Okay, can you hear me?
A little bit of an echo.
Yeah, can you? Okay. Is it better now?
Yes.
All right. So, hi everyone. Glad to share more about localization. That might be a little bit less known subject to the audience that we have. But so most of the things that we talk today is basically at this point, the movie or the TV show is going to be ready in the original language, which is like mostly English. And then in localization, the task is to get that finished picture and sound and globalize the content, which is usually preparing the content for 40 to 60 different countries. And one of the important things about it is it has a huge impact on a content consumption internationally. For example, if something is like, say, there's a Pixar movie and you want to release it in Europe, so the 5-year-old kid in Norway, they can't speak English, they cannot read, so so that's getting that animation and then dubbed it in Norwegian for the concept in that country. And on a typical new release or TV show, we usually dub it in 20 languages and create subtitles for 40 to 60 languages. It's a growing industry right now because of all the original content, Amazon and the Netflix of the world, and also the portion of the box office internationally is increasing. So they're getting this content and then making it ready for release in those countries. And it's not just translation, so that's one of the big things about localization, that you need to really do it based on the cultural aspects of each territory. So some examples of, for example, for Japanese, like if their movie is in English, and then in America, usually people talk really informally to their boss or to their parents. But if you're dubbing that in Japanese or creating subtitle for it, those relationships is usually formal relationship. So getting it and basically creating it to that culture and based on all the story of the movie or the TV show. And on a typical process, again, that when we get a new release movie or TV show and we dub it in 20 language or subtitle in 46 language, so there are on average between voice actors, dubbing directors, and then translators, there are about 1,000 to 2,000 people involved in 40 different countries, and then 5 of those people might be in America. So the majority of the people are in, say, Asia, Europe, Middle East, and everywhere, like South America and everywhere in the world. And so there are some key pieces of the localization. So the first step is we create the master script, which is basically creating all English material, all English subtitle, and have it ready for language services or going internationally. So, and then part of the localization services, our subtitling, closed captioning, text and metadata. For example, if we're localizing a content and it's going to be on iTunes in India, so the description of movie should be in Indian or in Hindi, and then so all marketing materials and packaging. So all those are being translated in those languages. And then dubbing, which is one of the key localization processes. And dubbing is basically a very highly creative process. It's like kind of a small production of that movie in that language. And like you have voice actors for the dubbing process. Like the process is going to be a casting process, voice casting process. There are voice actors. Say if you're dubbing in Italian, there are voice actors that are going to audition for it. And then it's going to be the casting system by dubbing director to pick the right voice actors. And then it's kind of similar to the content here. Like say, for example, George Clooney, the voice of George Clooney is always the same person in Italy or in Turkey. And they're as famous as George Clooney here. Like people in restaurant, they know those people and they get their autographs. So there are really famous people for famous characters here. If someone is voice of George Clooney or Brad Pitt or Al Pacino. And but for new actors, you always do the casting. And then there's a session for voice recording that's for any line in English. They're gonna record. There is a dubbing directors making sure that it's basically what they recorded and the way that they recorded is correct or it follows the story. It has a creative intent. So and then it goes to the subtitling process as well. That the same thing when you do the translation, when you're creating the subtitle, you're really creating it for that culture and for that country. And technology is now growing in localization. So a lot of artificial intelligence and machine learning is having a huge impact now. You hear a lot of like auto translation. So far, the technology is not there to replace like the creative process or human in this area, but it's getting there to really support it and then enable more, creative people then support the creative process. And the quality of the localization is going really higher, like again, based on the many shows from Netflix and Amazon of the world, there's a huge focus on the quality of the shows. And another aspect of localization is like when there's a foreign language original and then localizing it in around the world. Like for example, if the content is being originated in Germany, and then the original language is Germany, getting that and then dub it in English or creating English subtitles, that you see many of those shows on Netflix and Amazon, and is increasing for other content owners. And then when localization is done, the next step for us is distribution. That is basically getting and package it in all those languages and then send it for distribution channels, digital retailers like Amazon and Netflix and iTunes and Hulu and Google, or on physical media like DVD and Blu-ray, and doing the final packaging and delivery to consumer.
Cool. Thank you very much. Actually, I have one question I'd love to ask you. Considering that dubbing process sounds quite tedious, how long do you usually get for that process?
So it depends on the territory. So some territories, the dubbing process is, as you say, is really tedious. Like say for especially for figs like French, Italian, Germany, and Spain. So that takes weeks, because from getting the actors, you got to bring the actors to the studio, they do the recording, and then you get another version of the movie. They need to come back to do the recording again. So that process is usually, say, 6 to 8 weeks, but it's getting more accelerated because all content owners, they want to release everything day and date, like after US release, that they release it in all 40 territories. So there's a lot of innovation is happening in the industry in this area that to shorten those timelines.
All right, thank you. Does anybody else have any questions?
There is one question in the queue from Ariana. The question is, do you think the new technologies like Voco or Lyrebird, which manipulate human voice, will affect dubbing in the future?
So it might. We're tracking those technology very closely. So right there, right now it's not there, because again, a lot of creative nuances going to it, that what the tone of the voice actor should be in this scene, or what they should say based on it. And it's necessarily not matching the English. It needs to match that culture. That's why automating some of those is really hard. But the technology is getting better and better every day, and we're always looking at, keeping an eye on it.
Thank you. There are no questions in the queue at the moment. Let's see. And as soon as I said that, Jim popped a question in. Jim says or asks, how many languages do you speak?
Me personally, or or some of the people that we have? Me, actually, it's not that many. I speak 3 languages fluently and 1 kind of I understand. But we, as a company, we do 60 plus languages, and we have some people that speak 7 languages.
Thank you. While we're waiting for additional questions, I would like to let our guests know that are still with us that I have put a link to the online survey that is very important for us. We want to know what your experience was like, what went well, if you have any suggestions about what we can improve. And in exchange for your feedback, when you submit the completed form, we will redirect you automatically to a copy of the diagram that was used during the presentation. And we do not have any see, that's all I have to do, is I just have to say we do not have any questions, and a question will appear. Martha says, I worked as an assistant editor for a Netflix show, and part of my responsibilities was to create the master script and all the subtitling. How long does this entire process usually take once you receive the master script?
So the subtitling process is much faster. Usually when we get the master as broadcast script, we create what we call English template, which is a template for translators to use it as a guide. And that usually takes between, say, 1 to 3 days. And then the translation process, again, it depends on the genre of the show and how much research translator needs to do. But it's usually like a week to 2 weeks process if it's not something tricky. But many things that goes there, like examples are like if in the show they're saying we ate lunch at Cheesecake Factory. So translators need to do research what Cheesecake Factory is or what is equivalent of that in that territory to make sense to the audience in that territory. But some contents require a lot of research, but some contents are easier to translate. But I would say usually between, say, 1 week to 2 weeks is standard timelines.
Very good. Let's see. How there are no additional questions. Martha says, thank you. Look, see, I told you. All I have to do is say there's no questions, and one pops up. Daniel asks, I'm a freelance assistant editor for a year and have been getting some freelance editorial work for the last year. What is the best way to get into the feature film business? Is there a resource for finding out feature film production companies?
I could maybe speak to this a little bit if you like. I think the best thing that I've seen is actually just reaching out. Now, if you're talking about working in post-production, which would be what I could be familiar with, you'd be surprised how many people I've seen get jobs just from writing an email, either to people who work there or walking in the door. Generally, I think I would recommend reaching out to different post facilities that you might be interested in working at and asking them if there's a job for you, and maybe anything you can do to get your foot in the door. Sometimes it may not be exactly the job you'd want to do initially, but a lot of the time it's important just for people to meet you and see that you have a good work ethic and that you may have the knowledge that would be useful to kind of put you in that seat. But definitely, I would say that that's the first thing, and then secondly, obviously, have a really good understanding of the tools and the technology and the kind of job you'd like to be involved with, I guess.
Great answer.
Another question that just popped up was, can someone touch on packaging of materials for Netflix deliverables? And we do that here at SIM, and we use the ColorFront transcoder software on a super micro PC. And the idea is we'll take that master file and we'll take the master video and sound, we'll take that into the transcoder, and we can render everything we need for each of the different deliverables. They have their own terminology, unlike like the VAM and the CTM that we may all be used to saying. They have similar things for their system, and it's all online and uploaded into their cloud system. So they have this new thing called Content Hub, and the idea is that each of these final deliverables get uploaded into there, and that is their archive for this stuff. So they're starting to move away from LTOs being the sole place that this stuff gets archived to, and now putting it up into their Amazon S3 bucket with this Content Hub interface.
Very good. And there are no questions in the queue. So are there any final comments that any of our speakers or you, Jesse, as moderator, would like to provide?
Not for me. I guess I'd just like to say thank you, everybody, for joining us. And I hope that all of the YEPs that were able to make it were able to get something from this, as well as everybody else. But we'll certainly follow up to see which department we should deep dive into as a sole focus for the next one.
Great. Stephanie comments, says, thank you. Wonderful presentation. And I would like to thank all our speakers for sharing their expertise and knowledge. It certainly was a jam-packed presentation. I'd like to thank our guests for spending a couple of hours with us. Hope you found it valuable. The meeting room will remain open for a few minutes while you use that link to go to the online survey. And as I said, in exchange for your feedback, once you submit that completed form, you will be automatically redirected to the diagram that was the basis for the discussion this evening. So thank you to everybody. Safe travels, and we'll see you next time on an HPA YEP webcast. Bye-bye now.